At that stage, I think Britain was number 3. There were only 4 countries in all of NATO that spent that sort of money on defence. Well, now Britain is number 12 in that proportion of the economy going on defence league table. And that's really quite important, I think, because it's led to an erosion of credibility, for example, among the partner nations of this thing called the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is a kind of serious guys within NATO group of the Baltic republics and the Nordic countries, which in general, they're all pretty serious now about the Russian threat, and Britain is supposed to be the leader of that group. And there are increasingly sort of overt mutterings from them that Britain is not doing enough.
Mark Urban is here, as he is every Monday, to talk us through the big foreign policy, diplomatic and defence stories. Hello, Mark.
Good morning.
Good morning. So, the Times reports today that Keir Starmer can expect to find himself sidelined by other leaders at this week's NATO summit, given he has 2 weeks left in office and because his defence investment plan isn't fully costed. Is this going to be an uncomfortable summit for Starmer?
Well, as always, with these set pieces, a lot will depend on the mood that Donald Trump is in. We've known him sometimes go to these big meetings and sort of stay on script, and then when chatting to the press on the plane home, blow the whole thing up. So we really don't know, and of course that's the business we're in during a Trump presidency is trying to predict this extraordinarily unpredictable person. I mean, I think Keir Starmer, he will think he's going with a good story to tell, because those spending increases that he announced last week for the defence investment plan were hard won in his terms. But of course, you've got a security establishment, military establishment in this country, and a lot of people abroad saying, no. I mean, if you are really serious about the language you've used about putting the country on the war footing and rebuilding the armed forces, you're only just getting started. This is really a start, but no more than that. He's
there among other world leaders who all have similar considerations to worry about. And while, he sort of gets slightly beaten up by, for example, Kemi Badenoch over defence funding, the leaders of other NATO nations, as they're sort of in the same boat, are they perhaps likely to be more charitable?
Well, it's a very uneven picture, and I guess one of the things I should have said in response to your first question is it isn't just about vibes. I mean, the objective reality here is that, to go back to the 2014 NATO summit, which was held in Wales, in fact, I went along to that, and that was a moment where David Cameron, because of what was going on in Crimea and Ukraine, was trying to get the Allies to go up to 2% of their economic output. Now, at that stage, I think Britain was number 3. There were only 4 countries in all of NATO that spent that sort of money on defence. Well, now Britain is number 12 in that proportion of the economy going on defence league table. And that's really quite important, I think, because it's led to an erosion of credibility, for example, among the partner nations of this thing called the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is a kind of serious guys within NATO group of the Baltic republics and the Nordic countries, which in general, they're all pretty serious now about the Russian threat, and Britain is supposed to be the leader of that group. And there are increasingly sort of overt mutterings from them that Britain is not doing enough, that we really aren't moving fast enough. Now, yes, you're right. Not all NATO countries are, stepping up the spending rapidly either. Of course, Spain is on the naughty step, because at the last NATO summit they actually explicitly said we won't do this. We won't go up to 3.5% by 2035. I beg your pardon. But then on the other flank, of course, you've got these countries like Poland that are way ahead of Britain in terms of the proportion of their economy going.
But surely, Mark, our 2.5%. Our 2.5% is a lot more money than Poland's 5% or whatever they are, isn't it?
Yeah, true. Cash terms, 62 billion or thereabouts this year in the UK on defence, which, of course, if you're an advocate for the NHS or education, already seems like rather a lot of money. But there it is. If Britain is going to be serious about meeting those targets and getting up towards this figure that it's set for NATO, that means about another 25 billion a year. Now, of course, that can be a build-up over the next 6 or 7 years if we meet it. But I think because of what we've learned when John Healey resigned and what we learned when this defence investment plan finally came out, is there's a big gap. And the front loading, which is what the military wanted, in other words, they wanted us to move more quickly towards that target, has not happened. And then if you say, well, how are we going to get from 2.7% of our economic output by 2030, which is now the government's policy, to 3.5%? Just 4 or 5 years later, and a lot of people think it's just not possible. And the problem with that is it is an own goal, to use a suitably footballing analogy today, because the government agreed to this. They agreed to this target at the last NATO summit in The Hague last summer. So they're not going to meet a target, or they're making it incredibly hard for whoever's in government from 2030 onwards to meet the target. And I think the anticipation of that, and of course the anticipation that the Keir Starmer will soon be a thing of the past, will make this a uniquely difficult summit for the UK.
It's a very different world from the world of even a year ago in The Hague. Because, I mean, back then, since that last NATO summit, Donald Trump has threatened to annex Greenland, threatened all kinds of troop withdrawals from Europe, started, and if you listen to him, finished the war in Iran, and a lot of that stuff has basically been in direct, at least political conflict with his supposed NATO allies. I'm trying to think, I mean, are you expecting it to be sort of bitter and fiery?
Well, I think a lot of the leaders there do a sort of Trump discount, don't they? They sort of adjust on the rhetoric and say, well, and they brief their press, well, you know what he's like. And of course, because of what happened with the Iran war, some of them, including Starmer, Emmanuel Macron of France, have discovered the political boost that can come from publicly opposing Trump. So I think we are in a different world in that sense too, compared with last year's summit. In that sense, the Americans have expended an awful lot of ordnance bombing Iran and an awful lot of political capital, and ended up with a result where they're less credible and their opinion is seen as being less influential in Europe. I mean, it's not great, but frankly, the fact that America's become so undependable, and I think a fair number of people, including I think generally my analysis, would say we can't assume that the next president will make everything all right again. Yeah, sure. And all of those things militate in favour of a bigger defence effort on the part of Europe, and that's where Starmer has a problem. He thinks he's gone the extra mile, but most of his interlocutors around the table don't really think he has.
Well, I've got you, Mark. You've also done a video for the Times Originals YouTube channel about the Ukraine war and Kyiv's ability to strike deep into Russia with long-range drones. What's changed in the last year as regards to Ukrainian capabilities?
Gosh, well, you've got the situation on the battlefield. It's turned into this even worse or even more sanguinary meat grinder for the Russian army. I don't think that's the decisive arena, though. There's what they call the middle-range strikes, which is 50 to 200 kilometres from that front line, which covers most of Crimea, of course, I think all of Crimea, and that's where things have really changed badly for the Russians. The Americans, the Starlink company, Elon Musk company, shut Russians out of the Starlink system. They were using it to basically get better accuracy and guidance and as a means of controlling drones. So now the Ukrainians have a big edge in that regard because they're still using it, and they've just got lots of programs that were put in place a year ago, 2 years ago, to make longer range drones coming to fruition at the same moment. Then if we go even deeper, the effect on the Russian oil industry. I mean, I was reading a fascinating post on social media this morning by Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who's a Russian political dissident, but he used to run the country's biggest oil company. And he's talking about the sort of doom loop that the Russian petrol and energy industry is in now. He reckons 25% of their refining capability has been knocked out. There are higher estimates than that by these Ukrainian drone strikes. We're seeing big petrol queues. We're seeing petrol being rationed in Crimea. All of this is bad for Putin in the sense of, the public notices. There's talk now of importing certain oil products. Unbelievable, really, for one of the world's biggest producers. And so all of that is changing the mood music and tilting the balance of the war. The big question is, does Putin respond by looking for a way out, or does he respond by escalation?
Mark Urban, thank you very much indeed. And you can see that latest video by Mark on the Times Originals YouTube channel. Just search Times Originals and you'll find it there, along with lots more documentaries, opinion pieces and explainers. Mark, always a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much indeed.